Have you ever been made to feel so small that you actually believed you were nothing? Have you ever had someone hand you a piece of paper and tell you to sign away your dignity because they assumed you'd never amount to anything without them? My name is Jessica Miller, and I'm about to tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about family, money, and the price of keeping the peace. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of Linda's famous pot roast filled the dining room, but it couldn't mask the tension that had been building for weeks. It was a Sunday in March, one of those deceptively warm days that tricks you into thinking winter is finally over. The cherry blossoms outside were just starting to bloom, and I remember thinking how beautiful they looked through the window, not knowing that this would be the last time I'd sit at this table without everything being different. I sat across from my husband Michael, watching him nervously adjust his napkin for the third time. We'd been married for 8 months, and these family dinners at his parents' house in Riverside Heights had become our weekly tradition. His mother, Linda, always insisted on cooking elaborate meals, and his father, Robert, would hold court at the head of the table, sharing stories from his days managing the local bank branch. His sister Amanda usually brought her latest boyfriend, and they'd all laugh at inside jokes that made me feel like a visitor in my own marriage. That particular Sunday, something was different. The conversation felt forced, like everyone was reading from a script they'd rehearsed. Linda kept glancing at Robert, who kept checking his watch. Amanda was unusually quiet, picking at her food instead of dominating the conversation like she normally did. Even Michael seemed on edge, which was strange because he was usually the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over any awkwardness with his easy smile and gentle humor. I worked as a freelance graphic designer at the time, taking on small projects for local businesses and nonprofits. It wasn't glamorous work, and the pay was inconsistent, but I loved the creative freedom and the flexibility it gave me. Michael had a steady job at an insurance company. Nothing spectacular, but it paid the bills and gave us decent health insurance. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we were comfortable, happy, building a life together one small step at a time. The Miller family, however, had different ideas about what constituted success. Robert had worked his way up from teller to branch manager over 30 years, and he wore that achievement like a Medal of Honor. Linda had been a stay-at-home mother who threw herself into community organizations and volunteer work, always making sure everyone knew about her contributions to various charity boards. Amanda had married young to a man whose family owned a small chain of car dealerships, and she never let anyone forget that she drove a BMW and lived in a house with a 3-car garage. They weren't wealthy, not really, but they carried themselves like they were, and they had very specific opinions about how family members should contribute to maintaining their image. Michael had warned me early in our relationship that his family could be particular about appearances, but I'd assumed that meant dressing nicely for church or not swearing at the dinner table. I had no idea it ran so much deeper than that. The conversation that night started innocently enough. Robert asked about our plans for the summer, whether we were thinking about taking a vacation. Michael mentioned that we might visit my parents in Colorado, and Linda's face immediately tightened. She started talking about how expensive travel had become, how young couples needed to be more careful with their money, how important it was to establish financial stability before indulging in luxuries. Then Amanda chimed in with stories about friends of hers who had gotten into financial trouble because they'd been too ambitious too early in their marriages. She painted these elaborate pictures of couples who'd lost their homes, who'd had to move back in with their parents, who'd ruined their credit and their relationships because they hadn't been realistic about their limitations. I felt my stomach start to knot as the conversation continued. There was something pointed about the way they were talking, something that felt aimed directly at me even though no one was making eye contact. Michael kept trying to change the subject, suggesting we help clear the table or asking about Robert's golf game. But his family kept steering the conversation back to money and responsibility and the importance of knowing your place. Finally, Robert cleared his throat and looked directly at me for the first time all evening. "Jessica," he said, his voice taking on the formal tone he probably used with difficult customers at the bank. "Linda and I have been talking, and we think it might be helpful to have a conversation about expectations." "Expectations about what?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. Linda leaned forward, her hands clasped together on the table like she was about to deliver a presentation. "Well, dear," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that immediately put me on guard. "We know that creative types like yourself can sometimes struggle with financial stability. It's not a criticism, it's just the nature of that kind of work. Feast or famine, as they say." Michael started to interrupt, but Robert held up a hand to stop him. "We're not trying to interfere," he continued, "but we think it would be best for everyone if we established some clear boundaries. About family finances. We've worked very hard to build what we have, and we want to make sure that everyone understands their responsibilities." Amanda nodded along like she was hearing this for the first time, though I could tell from her expression that she'd been part of these discussions. She'd probably even suggested some of this herself. She'd never liked me. Not from the moment Michael first brought me home. I was too artsy, too unpredictable, too different from the kind of woman she thought her brother should marry. I still didn't understand what they were asking for. Not exactly, but I could feel the walls closing in around me. The pot roast that had smelled so delicious earlier was now sitting heavy in my stomach, and I had to concentrate on keeping my voice steady when I asked them to be more specific about what they meant. That's when Linda reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder. She slid it across the table to me like she was presenting evidence in a court case. Inside was a typed document, 3 pages long, with official-looking language and spaces for signatures at the bottom. It was a contract, they explained, a family financial agreement that would protect everyone's interests. The basic premise was simple. In exchange for being welcomed into the Miller family, I would agree never to ask them for money, never to expect financial support during difficult times, never to assume that family resources would be available to help Michael and me if we found ourselves in trouble. The document spelled out specific scenarios. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If we lost our jobs, we couldn't ask for help with rent or mortgage payments. If we had medical bills, we couldn't expect them to contribute. If we wanted to make a major purchase like a house or a car, we couldn't assume they'd help with a down payment or co-sign a loan. Even smaller things were covered. We couldn't borrow money for vacations, for wedding expenses for friends, for emergency car repairs. But it went further than that. The contract also included clauses about family events and gift-giving. If they threw parties or celebrations, I couldn't expect them to cover my expenses or include me in family gifts. If there were family trips or group activities, I needed to be able to pay my own way or politely decline to participate. Even things like birthday presents and Christmas gifts were outlined. I could give them, but I shouldn't expect reciprocation if the financial burden became too much for them. The most insulting part was the final section, which essentially stated that I understood my financial limitations and wouldn't allow my struggles to become a burden on the family's reputation or social standing. If we encountered money problems, I agreed to handle them discreetly and not to discuss them with other family members, friends, or community members in a way that might reflect poorly on the Miller name. As I read through the document, I could hear Linda explaining their reasoning in the background. They'd seen too many families torn apart by money issues, she said. They'd watched friends deal with in-laws who had unrealistic expectations and made demands that put strain on everyone involved. This was simply a way to make sure everyone was on the same page from the beginning, to prevent any misunderstandings or hurt feelings down the road. Robert nodded along, adding that they weren't trying to be cruel or unwelcoming. They loved Michael, and they wanted his marriage to succeed, but they also needed to protect the financial security they'd worked so hard to build. They were getting older, he explained, thinking about retirement, and they couldn't afford to take on additional responsibilities or obligations. Amanda jumped in with examples of friends whose marriages had been damaged by financial disagreements with in-laws. She made it sound like she was trying to help me avoid those kinds of problems, like this contract was actually a gift that would save me from future disappointment and conflict. Through all of this, Michael sat silent, staring at his hands, occasionally glancing at me with an expression that was part apology and part pleading. I could tell he was torn between defending me and keeping peace with his family, and I realized that this conversation had probably been going on for weeks without me knowing about it. They'd worn him down, convinced him that this was reasonable, that this was necessary, that this was actually for our own good. The room fell quiet as I finished reading the contract. Everyone was watching me, waiting to see how I'd react. I could feel the weight of their expectations, their assumption that I'd be grateful for their clarity, that I'd appreciate their honesty, that I'd sign their document with relief because it removed any awkwardness about money from our family, relationships. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Here were people who considered themselves middle class, who lived in a nice but modest neighborhood, who drove decent but not luxurious cars, acting like they were protecting a vast fortune from a gold-digging daughter-in-law. Part of me wanted to get angry, to point out how insulting and presumptuous the whole thing was, to ask them what exactly they thought I might want to steal from them, but mostly, I felt sad. Sad that this was how they saw me, as a potential threat to their security, rather than as someone who loved their son and wanted to build a life with him. Sad that they'd felt the need to create legal barriers between us, instead of just talking to me about their concerns. Sad that Michael had gone along with this instead of standing up for me, instead of telling his family that their fears were unfounded and their approach was hurtful. I looked up from the contract to find them all still watching me, still waiting. Linda had that tight smile she wore when she was trying to appear reasonable while doing something completely unreasonable. Robert was drumming his fingers on the table, probably ready to move on to dessert and lighter conversation. Amanda was practically glowing with satisfaction, clearly pleased that they were finally addressing what she saw as the elephant in the room. Michael was the only one who looked uncomfortable, but even he seemed to be waiting for me to just sign the papers and let everyone move past this awkward moment. He probably thought I'd understand their position, that I'd appreciate their desire to avoid future conflicts, that I'd be mature enough to agree to their terms without making a scene. They had no way of knowing that I'd been supporting myself since I was 16, working part-time jobs through high school and college, building my freelance business from nothing while my classmates were asking their parents for spending money. They didn't know that I'd never asked anyone for financial help, not even my own parents, because I'd learned early that independence was the only real security I could count on. They couldn't have guessed that I'd actually been making more money than they realized, that my little graphic design business was growing faster than I'd shared with anyone, including Michael. I'd been downplaying my success because I didn't want to seem like I was bragging, and because I'd been raised to believe that talking about money was impolite. But sitting there at their dining room table, holding their contract in my hands, I realized that my politeness had been mistaken for weakness, my discretion had been interpreted as failure, and my love for their son had been seen as a calculated investment in their family's resources. I set the contract down on the table and looked at each of them in turn. Then I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I smiled, reached for my purse, and pulled out a pen. Without saying a word, I signed the document, dated it, and slid it back across the table to Linda. The relief in the room was palpable. Linda actually clapped her hands together softly, and Robert leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression. Amanda looked triumphant, like she'd just won a contest she'd been preparing for all her life. Even Michael relaxed, probably grateful that I hadn't caused a scene or made things difficult for his family. But as I handed over that signed contract, I made a quiet promise to myself. They wanted to make sure I never asked them for money, and I was going to give them exactly what they'd asked for. They'd never hear a word about my finances, never get a glimpse into my bank accounts, never know whether I was struggling or thriving. They'd protected themselves from me, and now I was going to protect myself from them. What they didn't realize, as they passed around their precious contract like a victory trophy, was that they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They'd assumed I was weak because I was kind, broke because I was creative, and desperate because I'd married their son. They'd drawn a line in the sand, and I was about to show them which side of that line the real power was on. As we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, as the conversation returned to safe topics like the weather and local news, as Linda proudly put the signed contract away in her folder, I sat quietly and planned my future. A future where the Miller family would learn exactly what they'd signed away, when they'd made me promise never to ask them for anything. They thought they were protecting their money from me. Instead, they'd just ensured that when I became more successful than any of them had ever dreamed possible, they'd never see a penny of it. The week after signing that contract, I woke up every morning with a strange sense of clarity I'd never experienced before. It was like someone had cleaned a window I hadn't realized was dirty. Michael went to work each day acting like nothing had changed, probably relieved that his family's little intervention had gone so smoothly. He'd kiss me goodbye at the door, remind me about dinner plans with his coworkers or weekend obligations with his parents, completely oblivious to the shift that had occurred inside me. I started paying attention to things I'd previously overlooked. The way Linda would make subtle comments about my clothes, suggesting that perhaps I should invest in more professional pieces if I wanted to be taken seriously by clients. The way Robert would ask pointed questions about my work schedule, implying that real businesses operated during traditional office hours. The way Amanda would share stories about successful women she knew, always emphasizing how they'd given up their artistic pursuits for more stable careers. These weren't isolated incidents, I realized. They were part of a pattern that had been building since the day I'd met them. They'd been systematically undermining my confidence, making me question my choices, preparing me to accept their version of who I was and what I was worth. The contract hadn't been the beginning of their campaign against me. It had been the culmination. I thought back to our wedding planning 8 months earlier, remembering details that had seemed insignificant at the time but now took on new meaning. Linda had insisted on approving the venue, the flowers, even the font on the invitations, always with the excuse that she had more experience with these things and wanted to help us avoid expensive mistakes. When I'd suggested hiring a friend of mine to do the photography, she'd shaken her head and said we needed someone more established, someone whose work would reflect well on the family. At the time, I'd been grateful for her involvement, interpreting her controlling behavior as motherly concern. I'd been so eager to fit into Michael's family, so determined to prove that I belonged, that I'd ignored the underlying message in all her help. She didn't trust my judgment. She didn't think I was capable of making good decisions. She saw me as a liability that needed to be managed. The rehearsal dinner had been particularly revealing, though I'd been too nervous and excited to process it properly then. Linda had seated me at the far end of the family table, separated from Michael by his cousins and their spouses. When my maid of honor had given a speech about how proud she was of my business success and creative achievements, I'd noticed Linda and Robert exchanging glances, the kind of look parents share when a child says something embarrassing in public. During the reception, I'd overheard Linda talking to her sister about the wedding expenses. She was complaining about how young couples today expected too much, how they wanted elaborate celebrations they couldn't really afford, how parents ended up bearing the financial burden because their children lacked realistic expectations. She'd been talking about me, I realize now. Even though my parents had paid for the wedding and Michael and I had specifically chosen a modest venue to keep costs down, The honeymoon had been another red flag I'd missed completely. We'd gone to a cabin in the mountains, a place I'd found online that offered hiking trails and beautiful views at a reasonable price. When we'd returned and shared photos with his family, Amanda had made jokes about our budget vacation, suggesting that next time we might want to consider somewhere more romantic, somewhere that would give us better stories to tell. Linda had nodded along, adding that first marriages deserved proper honeymoons, the kind that created lasting memories. Even the apartment Michael and I had chosen together had been subject to their criticism, though they'd dressed it up as helpful advice. The neighborhood was up and coming, they'd said, which everyone knew was code for questionable. The building was charming, but old buildings came with unexpected expenses. The rent was reasonable, but that usually meant the landlord was cutting corners somewhere. They'd managed to find fault with every aspect of our living situation while maintaining the pretense that they were just looking out for our best interests. Now that I understood their true opinion of me, I started noticing how differently they treated other family members. When Amanda had wanted to redecorate her living room, Linda had enthusiastically offered to help shop for furniture and had even contributed money toward new curtains. When Michael's cousin David had lost his job, Robert had immediately offered to make some calls and see if he could help him find something in the banking industry. When Amanda's husband had mentioned wanting to expand his father's business, the whole family had brainstormed ideas and offered to spread the word among their friends. But when I'd mentioned wanting to upgrade my computer equipment to handle larger design projects, Linda had launched into a lecture about the importance of living within our means. When I'd talked about taking a continuing education course to learn new software, Robert had questioned whether it was wise to spend money on training when I should be focusing on building my current client base. When I'd shown them a website I'd designed for a local restaurant, they'd politely looked at it for 30 seconds before changing the subject to something more interesting. The contrast was so stark that I couldn't believe I'd missed it before. They'd been treating me like an outsider from the very beginning, tolerating my presence because Michael loved me but never actually accepting me as part of their circle. The contract had simply formalized what they'd already believed, that I was a burden they needed to protect themselves from, a financial risk they had to manage carefully. What made it even more insulting was how wrong they were about my actual situation. While they'd been worrying about me becoming a drain on their resources, I'd been quietly building something they couldn't even comprehend. My freelance graphic design business hadn't just been growing, it had been exploding in ways I'd barely shared with anyone, including Michael. 3 months before the contract incident, I'd landed my first major corporate client, a tech startup, that needed a complete brand identity package. The project had paid more than I typically made in 6 months, and it had led to referrals to other companies in their network. I'd been working late nights and weekends, not because I was struggling to make ends meet, but because I was trying to keep up with demand. The week before the family dinner where they'd presented me with their contract, I'd received an email that had made me sit at my desk for 10 full minutes, reading and rereading to make sure I wasn't imagining things. A mid-sized marketing firm in the city wanted to offer me a retainer contract worth more than Michael made in a year. They'd seen my work through mutual connections and wanted to bring me on as their primary design consultant for a portfolio of high-end clients. I'd been planning to tell Michael about the opportunity that weekend, to discuss whether I should take on such a large commitment and what it might mean for our future. I'd been excited to share the news with his family too, thinking they might finally understand that my career was more than just a hobby or a way to pass time until I found something more traditional. Instead, I'd found myself sitting at their dinner table, listening to them explain why they needed to protect themselves from my financial instability. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. While they'd been crafting their contract to shield themselves from my imagined poverty, I'd been turning down projects because I was already booked solid for the next 4 months, but I didn't tell them. Something about the way they'd presented their demands, the assumption that I'd be grateful for their clarity, the smug satisfaction on Amanda's face as I'd signed their papers, had triggered a protective instinct I didn't even know I possessed. They wanted to keep me at arm's length financially? Fine. They'd never know how unnecessary their precautions were. They'd never know what they could have been part of if they'd chosen inclusion over protection. The morning. After I signed the contract, I called the marketing firm and accepted their retainer offer. That afternoon, I opened a separate business bank account that only I had access to. I set up a new business credit card in my name alone. I created a dedicated workspace in our apartment's spare bedroom and invested in the computer equipment. I'd been wanting for months. I did all of this quietly, without fanfare, without asking anyone's opinion or permission. Michael noticed that I was working more, but when he asked about it, I kept my answers vague. Just some new projects, I'd tell him. Nothing major, just staying busy. When he offered to help or asked if I needed anything, I'd smile and say I had. Everything under control. It wasn't exactly lying, but it wasn't the full truth either. I was protecting information the same way his family was protecting their money. Within 2 weeks of signing their contract, my business income had tripled. Within a month, it had surpassed Michael's salary. By the end of that first quarter, I was making more money than Robert had probably ever made in his best year at the Y Bank. But I lived exactly the same way I had before, wearing the same clothes, driving the same car, buying groceries from the same store. The only difference was the growing number in my bank account and the growing distance I felt from the people who'd made me sign a promise to never burden them. The Sunday dinners continued as usual, but now I experienced them differently. Instead of trying to impress Linda with stories about my work or seeking Robert's approval for my business decisions, I sat quietly and observed them. I watched Amanda brag about her husband's latest car lot promotion as if selling 12 vehicles in a month was equivalent to running a Fortune 500 company. I listened to Linda complain about the cost of her book club's annual trip, a weekend getaway that cost less than I now made in 2 days. I nodded along when Robert explained basic financial principles to Michael and me, concepts I'd been applying successfully to my own business for months. They had no idea that the person they'd deemed financially unreliable was now earning more than all of them combined. They couldn't have imagined that their contract had liberated me from caring about their opinions or seeking their validation. They'd drawn a line between us, and from my side of that line, I could see clearly for the first time how small their world really was. The transformation wasn't just financial, it was psychological. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't trying to prove myself to anyone. I wasn't seeking approval or permission or validation from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth those things. I was simply doing my work, building my business, creating value for clients who appreciated what I brought to their projects. My confidence grew with every successful project, every satisfied client, every referral that led to another opportunity. I started charging higher rates because I realized my work was worth it. I began turning down projects that didn't align with my vision because I could afford to be selective. I invested in additional training and equipment because I had the resources to bet on myself. The contrast between my growing success and the Miller family's continued mediocrity became more apparent every week. While I was fielding calls from potential clients across multiple states, they were still focused on their small-town social circles and their modest achievements. While I was building relationships with business owners and entrepreneurs who thought big and moved fast, they were still gossiping about neighbors and celebrating tiny victories like Robert getting mentioned in the bank's monthly newsletter. I started declining some of their invitations, not out of spite, but because I genuinely had better things to do. When they planned family gatherings, I'd often have client calls or project deadlines that took priority. When they suggested group activities, I'd politely explain that my schedule was packed. They interpreted my busy schedule as exactly what they'd expected, proof that I was struggling to make my impractical career work, evidence that I was finally learning the value of hard work and responsibility. They had no way of knowing that I was turning down social events because I was building something bigger than their comprehension. something that would eventually make their contract look like the petty document it had always been. They thought they were watching me learn my place in their family hierarchy, when actually they were watching me outgrow their entire world. The most satisfying part wasn't the money itself, though the financial security was certainly nice. The most satisfying part was the knowledge that I was becoming exactly the person I'd always had the potential to be, the person I might have been all along if I hadn't been so concerned with fitting into their narrow definition of acceptable. Their contract had given me permission to stop caring about their approval, and that freedom had unleashed abilities and ambitions I'd been suppressing without even realizing it. By the time spring turned to summer, I was working with clients in 6 different states. My portfolio included projects for tech companies, healthcare organizations, nonprofit foundations, and boutique retail brands. I'd been featured in 2 design industry publications and had been invited to speak at a conference in Chicago. My business had grown so quickly that I'd started turning away work and referring potential clients to other designers in my network. But when the Miller family asked how I was doing, I'd just smile and say business was steady. When they made their subtle comments about the importance of financial planning and realistic expectations, I'd nod along like I was taking their advice to heart. When they reminded me, directly or indirectly, about the contract I'd signed, I'd thank them for helping me understand my boundaries and responsibilities. What they didn't understand was that their contract had become the best thing that had ever happened to me. They'd intended it as a cage, but it had actually been a key. They'd tried to limit my access to their modest resources, and instead, they'd motivated me to build resources that dwarfed anything they could have offered. They'd wanted to make sure I knew my place, and they'd accidentally shown me that my place was far above anything they could have imagined. The girl who'd signed their contract in March was gone by June, replaced by a woman who didn't need their money, their approval, or their acceptance. I was still married to Michael, still polite at family gatherings, still playing the role they expected me to play. But underneath that familiar exterior, I was becoming someone they wouldn't recognize, someone whose success would eventually make their protective measures look not just unnecessary, but tragically short-sighted. They'd been so worried about me asking them for money that they'd never considered the possibility that someday they might need to ask me. They'd been so focused on protecting what they had that they'd never imagined I might accumulate more. They'd been so certain of my limitations that they'd never prepared for my potential. And as summer approached and my business continued to grow, I knew that eventually, inevitably, they were going to discover just how wrong they'd been about everything. The first crack in the Miller family's perfect facade appeared on a Tuesday morning in July. Michael came home from work looking shaken, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by something I'd never seen before: genuine worry. He sat at our kitchen table, loosening his tie with hands that trembled slightly, and told me that his father had called him into a private meeting that afternoon. Robert's bank branch was being consolidated with another location across town. After 31 years of faithful service, he was being offered an early retirement package that was far less generous than he'd been expecting. The pension he'd counted on for his golden years had been reduced due to market fluctuations and corporate restructuring. The health insurance benefits he'd assumed would carry him and Linda through retirement would end in 6 months, unless he paid for expensive COBRA coverage. Michael kept running his hands through his hair as he explained the situation, a nervous habit he'd developed as a child whenever his family faced any kind of stress. His father hadn't just lost his job, he'd lost his identity. Robert Miller, respected bank manager, pillar of the Riverside Heights community, trusted financial advisor to family and friends, had become just another middle-aged casualty of corporate downsizing. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was the man who'd made me sign a contract promising never to ask his family for financial help, now facing the kind of economic uncertainty he'd assumed I'd bring into their lives. The same person who'd lectured me about living within my means and building realistic expectations was discovering that even careful planning couldn't protect you from forces beyond your control. But what struck me most wasn't Robert's situation itself, but how the family was handling it. Instead of pulling together and supporting each other through a difficult transition, they were all scrambling to protect their individual positions. Amanda had immediately started distancing herself, making it clear that she and her husband couldn't offer any financial assistance because they were saving for their own house renovation. Linda was panicking about their retirement plans and suggesting they might need to sell their home and move somewhere smaller, somewhere cheaper, somewhere that would reflect their new reduced circumstances. Michael was caught in the middle, feeling obligated to help his parents but unsure how much assistance he could realistically provide on his insurance company salary. He looked at me across our kitchen table with an expression that was part guilt and part hope, clearly wondering if I might have any suggestions or resources that could help his family navigate this crisis. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old Jessica, the one who would have immediately started brainstorming solutions and offering whatever support I could manage. But then I remembered the contract sitting in Linda's file folder, remembered the evening they'd made me promise never to become a burden on their family finances, remembered the smug satisfaction on their faces as I'd signed away any claim to their assistance or generosity. I reached across the table and squeezed Michael's hand, offering comfort and sympathy for his father's situation. I listened as he talked through various scenarios and possibilities. I agreed that it was a difficult time for the whole family, and that these kinds of corporate decisions affected everyone, not just the employee being let go. But I didn't offer money. I didn't suggest business contacts who might be able to help Robert find consulting work. I didn't mention that I could easily cover their mortgage payments for the next 2 years without affecting my own financial stability. Instead, I honored the agreement his family had demanded. I stayed out of their financial business completely. Over the following weeks, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Robert's pride prevented him from adapting quickly to his new circumstances. Instead of immediately looking for part-time work or consulting opportunities, he spent his days at the country club, maintaining his regular golf schedule and lunch meetings as if nothing had changed. He seemed to believe that if he kept up appearances long enough, another management position would materialize, something worthy of his experience and reputation. Linda enabling this fantasy, partly because she was in denial herself and partly because she was terrified of what their friends would think if Robert took a job she considered beneath his qualifications. She'd built her entire social identity around being the wife of a successful bank manager. The thought of him working retail or taking a position that didn't come with a title and an office was almost more than she could bear. Meanwhile, their savings were disappearing faster than they'd anticipated. The early retirement package had provided a modest lump sum, but it wasn't nearly enough to maintain their current lifestyle until Robert could collect his full pension benefits. They'd assumed they had more liquid assets than they actually possessed, and they'd underestimated how expensive healthcare would be without Robert's employer benefits. Amanda's response to her parents' crisis revealed exactly the kind of person she really was. Instead of offering emotional support or practical assistance, she spent her time making suggestions about lifestyle changes they should consider. Maybe they didn't really need such a large house. Maybe they could find a less expensive country club membership. Maybe Linda should consider getting a part-time job herself, something in retail or customer service that would bring in a little extra income. These suggestions might have been reasonable if they'd come from a place of genuine concern, but Amanda delivered them with barely concealed irritation, as if her parents' financial problems were an inconvenience she shouldn't have to deal with. She was particularly vocal about how their situation might affect the family's reputation in the community, worrying that Robert's job loss would reflect poorly on the rest of them. Michael was trying to be supportive, but his own resources were limited. He offered to help with smaller expenses and suggested they move in with us temporarily if they needed to sell their house, but these gestures felt inadequate given the scope of the problem. He was watching his parents' security crumble, and there wasn't much he could do about it with his modest salary and our supposedly tight budget. The stress was affecting everyone differently. Robert became withdrawn and defensive, snapping at family members who offered advice and rejecting suggestions that didn't align with his view of himself as a successful professional. Linda oscillated between frantic problem-solving sessions and periods of depression where she'd sit in her garden for hours, staring at the flowers she might not be able to afford to maintain much longer. Michael started having trouble sleeping, and I'd often find him at the kitchen table late at night, working through calculations on scratch paper, trying to figure out how much assistance he could provide without jeopardizing our own stability. He'd inherited his father's sense of responsibility, but lacked the resources to act on it effectively. During this same period, my business was experiencing another growth surge that felt almost surreal given what was happening with Michael's family. The marketing firm retainer had led to connections with other agencies, and I was now working with clients across the country on projects that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. I'd hired 2 subcontractors to help manage the workload, and I was considering renting actual office space instead of working from our spare bedroom. The contrast between my professional success and the Miller family's financial collapse was stark, but I kept that information completely separate from their crisis. When Michael mentioned his parents' struggles, I listened sympathetically and offered emotional support. When he stressed about how to help them, I encouraged him to do whatever felt right within his means. When he wondered aloud about possible solutions, I agreed that it was a challenging situation without offering any solutions of my own. This wasn't cruelty, it was consistency. They'd established the boundaries, and I was respecting them completely. The contract I'd signed hadn't just protected them from any requests I might make. It had also protected me from any obligations I might feel. They'd wanted our financial lives to be separate, and I was giving them exactly what they'd asked for. The most telling moment came during a family dinner in August, when Robert finally admitted that they might need to consider more drastic changes to their lifestyle. He'd been forced to acknowledge that another management position wasn't going to appear, and that he'd need to start looking at other types of work to bridge the gap until his pension kicked in. Linda looked around the table at Michael, Amanda, and me, and for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely vulnerable. She talked about how scared she was, how unprepared they felt for this kind of upheaval, how much they'd counted on financial stability in their retirement years. Her voice broke as she described the possibility of losing their home, the place where they'd raised their children and built their life together. Amanda immediately launched into another speech about the importance of being realistic and making practical decisions, but there was an edge to her voice that suggested she was more concerned about how their problems might affect her than she was about their actual well-being. She kept emphasizing that everyone needed to take care of themselves first, that it wasn't fair to expect other family members to sacrifice their own security to solve problems they hadn't created. Michael looked torn between his natural impulse to help and his practical limitations. He talked about possibly taking a second job or cutting back on our expenses so he could contribute more to their situation, but even he seemed to realize that his efforts alone wouldn't be enough to solve their fundamental problems. Throughout this conversation, no one looked at me expectantly. No one suggested that I might have resources or connections that could help. No one even seemed to consider that the person they'd made sign a contract about financial independence might have achieved exactly that independence in ways they'd never imagined. This was the moment when I fully understood the power of their contract, not as the limitation they'd intended, but as the protection it had become for me. Because I'd agreed never to ask them for financial help, they couldn't ask me for financial help either. Because they'd established that our economic lives were separate, they had no standing to expect me to share information about my income or assets. Because they'd insisted on protecting themselves from my potential financial instability, they'd forfeited any claim to my actual financial success. As I sat at that dinner table, listening to them struggle with problems I could solve with a single phone call or a single check, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete emotional detachment from their crisis. It wasn't that I wanted them to suffer, but their suffering was no longer my responsibility. They'd made that very clear 6 months earlier when they'd drawn their careful legal boundaries around family financial obligations. The dinner ended with no clear solutions and a lot of unresolved anxiety. Robert and Linda went home to their increasingly precarious situation. Amanda went home to her comfortable life, probably relieved that she'd successfully avoided any commitment to help her parents. Michael and I went home to our apartment, where he spent another sleepless night worrying about problems he couldn't solve. But I slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that I was honoring the agreement his family had insisted upon. They'd wanted financial independence and clear boundaries, and they were getting exactly that. The fact that those boundaries now worked in my favor instead of theirs wasn't my concern. They'd written the rules, and I was simply playing by them. Over. The next several weeks, Robert's situation continued to deteriorate. He finally swallowed his pride enough to apply for a few retail management positions, but his overqualification made him an unattractive candidate to employers who assumed he'd leave as soon as something better came along. His age worked against him in a job market that favored younger, more adaptable workers. His decades of banking experience, which he'd always considered his greatest asset, had become almost irrelevant in a rapidly changing economy. Linda started working part-time at a boutique clothing store, a job that paid barely above minimum wage and offered no benefits. The work was exhausting for someone her age, and the social dynamics were humiliating for someone who'd spent years positioning herself as a community leader. She'd gone from organizing charity events to folding sweaters and dealing with difficult customers, and the adjustment was brutal. Their house went on the market in September, priced optimistically at first, but reduced multiple times as months passed without serious offers. The real estate market in their neighborhood had softened, and homes were sitting for much longer than anyone had expected. They were caught in the worst possible situation, needing to sell quickly for financial reasons but unable to attract buyers willing to pay anywhere near their asking price. Amanda's husband's car dealership started experiencing its own problems around the same time, as economic uncertainty made consumers reluctant to make major purchases. The steady income Amanda had always counted on became irregular and unpredictable, leaving her less able to help her parents even if she'd been inclined to do so. She responded to her own financial stress by becoming even more critical of her parents' situation, suggesting that their problems were the result of poor planning and unrealistic expectations. Michael was working overtime whenever possible, trying to increase his income enough to make a meaningful difference in his parents' situation. But individual overtime shifts couldn't address the scope of their problems, and the extra work was affecting his health and our relationship. He was exhausted, stressed, and increasingly frustrated by his inability to fix a situation that seemed to worsen every week. During this period, I received an invitation that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. A prestigious design conference in San Francisco wanted me to be a featured speaker, presenting a case study about building a successful creative business in a digital economy. The speaking fee alone was more than Robert had made in his last month at the bank, and the networking opportunities would likely generate enough new business to support the Miller family for the next 2 years. I accepted the invitation without mentioning it to anyone in Michael's family. I booked my flight and hotel room, prepared my presentation, and packed for a trip that would showcase exactly how far I'd come since signing their contract. But as far as they knew, I was just taking a few days off to visit a college friend. Nothing more significant than a personal vacation. The night before my flight, Michael and I had dinner with his parents one last time before their situation reached its inevitable conclusion. Robert had finally accepted a part-time position at a home improvement store, swallowing his pride for a job that paid a fraction of his former salary. Linda was working longer hours at the boutique, trying to maximize her small income before the holiday shopping season ended, and her hours were reduced again. They looked older than they had 6 months earlier, worn down by stress and uncertainty, and the constant worry about their future. The confident, controlling people who'd presented me with a contract to protect their financial stability had been replaced by anxious, diminished versions of themselves, people who'd discovered that even careful planning couldn't guarantee security. As we said goodbye that evening, I hugged them both and wished them well, knowing that this might be the last time I'd see them in their family home. By the time I returned from San Francisco, they'd likely be living somewhere smaller, somewhere that reflected their new reality, somewhere that would remind them daily of how quickly circumstances could change. But I also knew that when I returned from my conference, I'd be coming back with new opportunities, new connections, and new levels of success that would make their contract look even more absurd than it already was. They'd spent so much energy protecting themselves from my imagined financial instability that they'd never considered the possibility that I might become the most financially stable person in the family. The girl who'd signed their contract was about to become the woman who could have solved all their problems with a single generous gesture. But thanks to the boundaries they'd insisted upon, that gesture would never come. They'd made their choices, and now they'd live with the consequences, while I lived with the freedom their contract had inadvertently provided. The San Francisco conference changed everything, though no one in Michael's family would understand the significance for months. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of successful entrepreneurs and creative professionals, I felt the final pieces of my transformation click into place. These weren't people who would ask me to sign contracts limiting my potential. These were people who recognized ambition when they saw it and wanted to invest in it. My presentation went better than I dared to hope. I talked about building a design business from scratch, about turning freelance gigs into corporate contracts, about scaling creative work without losing artistic integrity. The audience was engaged, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes on strategies they could apply to their own ventures. When I finished, the applause felt different from any recognition I'd received before. It wasn't polite acknowledgement, it was genuine respect. The networking reception afterward became a cascade of opportunities. A venture capital firm specializing in creative agencies wanted to discuss potential partnerships. A tech company was looking for a design director for their new West Coast division. 3 different marketing executives handed me business cards and suggested lunch meetings to explore ongoing collaborations. By the end of the evening, I had enough potential business to keep me busy for the next 3 years. But the most significant conversation happened almost by accident. I was standing near the bar, checking my phone between conversations when a woman approached me with a knowing smile. She introduced herself as Sarah Chen, founder and CEO of a creative consultancy that worked with Fortune 500 companies on brand transformation projects. She'd been in the audience during my presentation and had recognized something in my story that resonated with her own experience. Sarah had built her company from nothing after leaving a corporate job where she'd been consistently overlooked and undervalued. She understood what it meant to be dismissed by people who couldn't see past their own limited expectations. More importantly, she had a proposition that would have seemed impossible just 18 months earlier, back when I was sitting at the Miller family dinner table signing their protective contract. Her company was expanding, and she needed someone to head up their new digital design division. It wasn't just a job offer, it was a partnership opportunity. She was looking for someone with proven entrepreneurial skills who could bring their own client base and build a team from the ground up. The base salary she mentioned was more than Robert had made in his best year at the bank. The profit-sharing potential was enough to make me financially independent for life. But what struck me most about Sarah's offer wasn't the money, though that was certainly impressive. It was the recognition of what I'd already accomplished and the confidence she showed in what I could achieve next. She saw my freelance success, not as a quaint hobby that needed to be managed carefully, but as proof of capabilities that could be scaled to much larger ventures. I told her I'd need time to consider the offer, not because I wasn't interested, but because the magnitude of the opportunity required careful thought. This wasn't just about my career. It was about fundamentally changing my relationship with everyone in my life, including Michael and his family. Taking Sarah's offer would mean revealing the full extent of my success in ways that couldn't be hidden or downplayed anymore. The flight home gave me hours to process what had happened and what it might mean. I thought about the contract sitting in Linda's file folder, the document they'd presented as necessary protection from my financial instability. I thought about Robert working retail to make ends meet while I was being offered executive positions at companies he'd never heard of. I thought about Amanda worrying about her family's reputation while I was being invited to speak at industry conferences and featured in business publications. Most of all, I thought about Michael, who was working overtime shifts to help his parents with problems I could solve without affecting my own financial security in any meaningful way. He had no idea that his wife was being courted by companies that could transform our entire lifestyle. He didn't know that the person his family had deemed financially unreliable was now in a position to help anyone in the family achieve financial independence. When I arrived home, Michael was waiting with updates about his parents' situation that had grown even more dire during my absence. The house sale had fallen through when the buyers couldn't secure financing. Robert had been forced to take a second part-time job stocking shelves at a grocery store, working overnight shifts that left him exhausted and demoralized. Linda had developed stress-related health problems that were affecting her ability to keep up with her retail job. Amanda had finally offered to help, but her version of assistance involved micromanaging their parents' budget and lifestyle choices, rather than providing actual financial support. She'd presented them with a detailed plan for downsizing their lives that felt more like punishment than help. Her suggestions included everything from canceling their newspaper subscription to shopping at discount grocery stores, delivered with the kind of condescending tone usually reserved for children who'd misbehaved. The whole family was fracturing, under the pressure. Robert's pride was preventing him from accepting the full scope of assistance he needed. Linda was bitter about having to work at her age and resentful that her children weren't doing more to help. Amanda was focused on protecting her own interests while maintaining plausible deniability about her parents' needs. Michael was caught in the middle, trying to balance competing demands with limited resources. As Michael shared these updates, I maintained the same supportive but detached stance I'd held throughout their crisis. I listened sympathetically, offered emotional support, and encouraged him to do whatever felt right within his means. But I didn't mention Sarah Chen's offer, didn't describe the opportunities that had emerged from my conference presentation, didn't reveal that I now had options that could change everything for everyone involved. The decision to accept Sarah's partnership offer came more easily than I'd expected. It wasn't just about the financial benefits, though those were substantial. It was about stepping fully into the person I'd been becoming since the night I'd signed the Miller family contract. They'd wanted me to know my place, and now I was finally ready to claim it. I called Sarah the next morning and accepted her offer, with a start date that would give me time to transition my existing clients and prepare for the move to a new level of professional responsibility. We spent the next hour discussing the details of our partnership, the structure of the new division, and the timeline for building the team I'd need to manage our projected growth. The contract Sarah sent over later that day was everything the Miller family document wasn't. Instead of limiting my potential, it recognized and invested in it. Instead of protecting others from my supposed instability, it bet on my proven stability and track record of success. Instead of requiring me to promise never to ask for anything, it offered resources, support, and opportunities I'd never dreamed of requesting. I signed Sarah's partnership agreement in my home office, surrounded by the equipment I'd purchased with income the Miller family didn't know I was earning, looking out at a future they couldn't imagine I was building. The contrast with that dinner table scene 18 months earlier was so complete, it felt like comparing two different lives lived by two different people. But I still didn't tell Michael immediately. Not because I wanted to hide my success, but because I wanted to time the revelation carefully. His family's contract had taught me the value of strategic information management. They'd shown me how much power could be gained or lost based on what people knew about your circumstances and when they learned it. Over the next few weeks, I began transitioning my freelance clients to subcontractors and preparing for my new role with Sarah's company. The process required several trips to the city for meetings, training sessions, and planning discussions. I told Michael these were business meetings related to my existing work, which was technically true even if it wasn't the complete truth. During this transition period, the Miller family crisis reached its lowest point. Robert and Linda were forced to accept that they couldn't maintain their current lifestyle and began looking seriously at smaller apartments and retirement communities they could afford on their reduced income. The emotional toll of downsizing wasn't just about money. It was about acknowledging that the life they'd planned and worked toward for decades was no longer possible. Amanda's response to her parents' forced downsizing revealed her true character in ways that surprised even me. Instead of offering to help them stay in their home or find a suitable alternative, she suggested they might be happier in a retirement community where they wouldn't have to worry about maintenance and upkeep. She presented this as concern for their well-being, but it was obvious she was more concerned about having elderly parents who needed ongoing support. The stress was affecting Michael's health and our marriage in ways I hadn't anticipated. He was working so much overtime that we barely saw each other. And when we were together, he was distracted by worry about his parents. He'd started having anxiety attacks and trouble sleeping, and he was losing weight from stress and irregular eating habits. His family's financial crisis was destroying his peace of mind and sense of security. One evening in late October, Michael came home from visiting his parents looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him. He sat on our couch and put his head in his hands, and for a moment I thought he might cry. When he finally looked up, he told me his parents had decided to declare bankruptcy. The combination of reduced income, ongoing expenses, and the failed house sale had made their debt load unmanageable. The bankruptcy wasn't just a financial decision. It was an admission of complete failure in the eyes of people who'd built their identities around fiscal responsibility and community respectability. Robert, who'd spent 30 years advising other people about sound financial planning, was admitting he couldn't manage his own money successfully. Linda, who'd prided herself on maintaining perfect credit and paying every bill on time, was defaulting on obligations she'd never imagined she wouldn't be able to meet. Michael looked at me with an expression of complete helplessness. He'd tried everything he could think of to help his parents, but his efforts had been inadequate against the scope of their problems. He felt like he was failing as a son, unable to protect the people who'd raised him and supported him throughout his life. The guilt was eating away at his self-esteem and sense of worth as a family member. This was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since the night I'd signed their contract. Not because I'd wanted them to suffer, but because I'd known that eventually their protective measures would be tested by real circumstances. They'd been so worried about protecting themselves from my potential financial instability that they'd never considered what would happen if they faced instability themselves. I sat next to Michael on our couch and held his hand while he talked through his feelings about his parents' situation. I listened as he blamed himself for not being more successful, for not having the resources to make a real difference in their crisis. I offered comfort and reassurance, reminding him that their problems weren't his fault, and that he'd done everything he reasonably could to help them. But I still didn't mention my new partnership or the resources I now had access to. Not because I wanted to withhold help, but because their contract had established that family financial problems were individual responsibilities. They'd made it clear that they expected people to handle their own difficulties without burdening other family members. I was simply honoring the boundaries they'd insisted upon. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. The people who'd been so concerned about me becoming a financial burden were now facing exactly the kind of crisis they'd worried I might bring into their lives. The difference was that my imagined instability had been replaced by proven success, while their assumed stability had been revealed as fundamentally fragile. As October turned to November, I received word that my partnership with Sarah's company had been approved by their board of directors. The announcement would be made publicly in December, along with the launch of our new digital design division. There would be press releases, industry coverage, and recognition that would make my success impossible to hide or minimize. I realized that Michael's family was about to discover the truth about my financial situation in the most public way possible. They'd learn that the person they'd made sign a contract about financial dependency had become one of the most successful people in their extended network. They'd see that their protective measures hadn't just been unnecessary. They'd been insulting to someone who was already more financially stable than they'd ever been. The timing felt appropriate, even poetic. Just as they were reaching their lowest point financially, they'd discover that the family member they'd excluded from financial consideration was now in a position to have helped them avoid their entire crisis. They'd realize that their assumptions about my capabilities and potential had been not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. But more than that, they'd understand that their contract had protected me from any obligation to share my success with them. They'd created a barrier designed to keep me from asking for help, and that same barrier now prevented them from expecting help from me. They'd built a wall to protect themselves, and they were about to discover they were on the wrong side of. The announcement was scheduled for early December, which meant I had a few more weeks to prepare for the conversation I'd been avoiding for almost 2 years. Michael deserved to know the truth about my success before he learned it from external sources. His family deserved to understand what their contract had really cost them, what opportunities they'd forfeited when they'd chosen protection over inclusion. I spent those weeks thinking about how to explain not just my current situation, but the journey that had brought me to this point. How to help them understand that their contract had been the catalyst for my transformation, that their attempt to limit my access to their resources had motivated me to build resources that surpassed anything they could have offered. Most importantly, I needed to help them understand that this wasn't about revenge or resentment. This was about consequences, about the natural results of the choices they'd made and the boundaries they'd established. They'd wanted financial independence and clear limits on family obligations. They were about to discover what those principles looked like when applied consistently and completely. The girl who'd signed their contract had evolved into a woman who didn't need their money, their approval, or their acceptance. But she was still Michael's wife, still technically part of their family, still bound by the agreement they'd insisted upon. The only difference was that now the power dynamic had shifted completely, and they were about to learn what it felt like to be on the other side of financial vulnerability. As December approached and my announcement date drew near, I found myself looking forward to their reaction not with malice, but with curiosity. How would they respond when they realized their assumptions had been wrong? How would they handle learning that their contract had protected the wrong person? How would they reconcile their treatment of me with the reality of who I'd become? The answers to those questions would reveal more about their character than any contract ever could. And for the first time since I'd met them, I was genuinely interested in what they had to say. The announcement hit the local business journal on a Tuesday morning in December. Local designer named partner in major creative consultancy read the headline, accompanied by a professional photograph of me that Sarah's company had commissioned specifically for the press release. The article detailed my background, my rapid rise in the design industry, and the significance of my new partnership role with one of the region's most respected creative agencies. The story mentioned my previous freelance success, my speaking engagements, and the projected growth of the new digital division I'd be heading. It included quotes from Sarah about my exceptional business acumen and proven track record of building client relationships. Most prominently, it featured the salary range for partnership-level positions at firms like ours, numbers that made it impossible to ignore the magnitude of my professional achievement. Michael found out the same way the rest of Riverside Heights did. Through the carefully worded announcement that made my success impossible to downplay or dismiss. He was drinking coffee at our kitchen table when his phone started buzzing with text messages from coworkers and friends, all congratulating him on his wife's remarkable business success. The confusion on his face as he read through these messages was quickly replaced by shock as he realized what he'd been missing. He called me at my temporary office setup, his voice a mixture of pride, bewilderment, and hurt. "Jessica," he said, "I'm getting messages about some announcement. People are saying you're a partner at some major company. What's going on?" I could hear the questions he wasn't asking. Why didn't I know about this? How long has this been happening? What else haven't you told me? I explained the situation as gently as I could, starting with the freelance growth that had accelerated after his family's contract dinner, and building up to Sarah's partnership offer and my decision to accept it. I told him about the conferences, the speaking engagements, the client base I'd been building while he was working overtime to help his parents. I explained that I'd kept the details private not to deceive him, but to honor the financial boundaries his family had established. The silence on his end of the call stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and strange. "So while my parents have been losing their house, while I've been working nights to help with their bills, you've been making enough money to solve all their problems?" The question hung between us like an accusation, though I could tell he was trying to understand rather than blame. I reminded him about the contract, about the explicit agreement that family financial situations would remain separate, about the boundaries his parents had insisted upon to protect themselves from exactly this kind of situation. I explained that I'd been honoring their wishes by keeping my financial life private and independent, just as they'd requested. I told him that their contract hadn't just protected them from my imagined instability, it had protected me from any obligation to rescue them from their actual instability. By the time we finished that conversation, Michael understood the full scope of what had happened. His family's protective measures had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. They'd been so worried about me becoming a financial burden that they'd never considered I might become a financial asset they'd excluded themselves from accessing. Their contract hadn't just been unnecessary, it had been counterproductive to their own interests. The news reached Robert and Linda through their bankruptcy attorney, who'd seen the Business Journal announcement and mentioned it during their meeting that afternoon. He'd commented casually about how nice it must be to have family members doing well during difficult times, assuming they were already aware of my success and perhaps counting on my support during their financial restructuring. Robert called Michael that evening, his voice tight with confusion and something that might have been anger. He wanted to know if the article was accurate, if I was really making the kind of money the Business Journal had implied, if there had been some mistake in the reporting. When Michael confirmed that the story was completely accurate, Robert fell silent for so long that Michael thought the call had dropped. When Robert finally spoke again, his voice had changed completely. He asked why I hadn't mentioned my success during their family dinners, why I'd never offered to help when their situation became desperate, why I'd sat quietly while they'd struggled with problems I could have solved easily. The hurt in his voice was unmistakable, but so was the confusion of someone trying to understand how his assumptions could have been so completely wrong. Michael explained about the contract, about the agreement they'd insisted I sign promising never to ask for financial help, about the boundaries they'd established to keep family financial situations separate. He reminded his father that they'd specifically wanted to protect themselves from any obligations related to my supposed financial instability. He pointed out that I'd been honoring their wishes exactly as they'd requested. The conversation that followed revealed the full extent of the Miller family's miscalculation. They'd assumed I was financially unreliable based on limited information and social prejudices about creative careers. They'd created legal barriers to protect assets that were smaller than what I was now earning in a single month. They'd excluded someone from family financial considerations who could have provided the kind of security they'd spent their lives trying to build. Linda's reaction was more complex than Robert's. When she learned about my success, Her first response wasn't hurt or confusion, but a kind of desperate hope. She called me directly, something she'd never done before, and asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss the family situation. Her voice was different than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the condescending tone she'd always used with me and replaced by something that sounded almost like respect. We met at a small cafe downtown, a neutral location where we could talk privately. Linda looked older than I remembered, worn down by months of stress and financial uncertainty. She dressed carefully for our meeting, probably trying to maintain some dignity despite her circumstances. But the expensive clothes she'd chosen only emphasized how much her situation had changed. She started the conversation by congratulating me on my success, praising my business acumen and entrepreneurial spirit in terms she'd never used before. She talked about how proud the family was of my achievements, as if she hadn't spent years, dismissing my career as impractical and unstable. The transformation in her attitude was so complete it felt surreal, like talking to someone wearing a Linda costume rather than Linda herself. Then she moved to the real purpose of our meeting. She wondered if, given my new circumstances, I might be willing to reconsider the boundaries we'd established around family financial matters. She suggested that perhaps the contract had been too rigid, that families should support each other during difficult times, regardless of previous agreements. She talked about the importance of helping elderly parents maintain their dignity and security in their retirement years. I listened to her carefully, noting how she framed her request as a family obligation rather than a personal favor. She was trying to rewrite the history of our relationship, to transform herself from someone who'd insisted on protecting herself from me into someone who'd always believed in supporting family members through difficult times. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable, but not surprising given how desperate their situation had become. When she finished her presentation, I responded with the same calm politeness she'd always used when explaining my limitations to me. I told her I appreciated her confidence in my current abilities, but that I believed strongly in honoring agreements and respecting boundaries that had been carefully established. I reminded her that the contract had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of awkward conversation, and that changing the terms now would undermine the clarity and independence they'd valued so highly. I explained that my business success had been built on principles of reliability and consistency, and that extending those principles to my personal relationships meant honoring commitments even when circumstances changed. I told her that I understood their situation was difficult, but that I was confident they'd find a way to handle their challenges independently, just as they'd expected me to handle mine. The expression on Linda's face as I delivered this response was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. It was the exact moment she realized that her contract hadn't just failed to protect her family's finances. It had permanently altered the power dynamic between us. She'd spent so much energy making sure I knew my place that she'd never considered what would happen if my place turned out to be above hers. Amanda's reaction to the news was perhaps the most predictable. She was furious, not just about my success, but about what she saw as my betrayal of family loyalty. She accused me of deliberately hiding my income to make her parents suffer, of using their contract as an excuse to be selfish and cruel. She seemed genuinely unable to understand that their boundaries worked both ways, that protection from financial obligations also meant protection from financial expectations. During a particularly heated family meeting, Amanda demanded to know why I thought I was better than everyone else, why I felt entitled to withhold help from family members in crisis. Her voice rose as she talked about family responsibility and moral obligations, completely ignoring the fact that these same principles had been absent when they'd created their contract 18 months earlier. Michael found himself in the impossible position of defending both his wife and his family, trying to explain to his sister that I was simply honoring the agreement she'd helped create. He pointed out that they couldn't simultaneously want financial independence and financial support, that they'd made their choice when they'd insisted on legal boundaries around money matters. The most telling part of Amanda's reaction was her assumption that my success somehow belonged to the family. that my achievements created automatic obligations to solve everyone else's problems. She couldn't accept that the same independence they'd insisted I maintain also gave me independence from their expectations and demands. She wanted the benefits of family connection without the reciprocal respect and inclusion that would have made such benefits possible. The community response to my success was entirely different from my family's reaction. Business leaders who'd never paid attention to me before started inviting me to networking events and advisory board positions. Organizations that had dismissed my previous work began reaching out about consulting opportunities. The same people who'd once shared the Miller family's assumptions about creative careers were now eager to associate themselves with my achievements. The contrast between public recognition and family resentment highlighted everything that was wrong with the Miller family's approach to relationships. They'd been so focused on protecting themselves from imagined threats that they'd alienated the person who could have been their greatest asset. They'd created barriers designed to keep me out, and those barriers had ultimately kept them out as well. 6 months after the announcement, the full consequences of their contract had become undeniable. Robert and Linda had been forced to move into a small retirement apartment, selling most of their possessions and accepting a lifestyle dramatically reduced from what they'd planned. Amanda's marriage was struggling under financial stress, and her husband's business was barely surviving the economic downturn that had affected several local industries. Michael and I had moved into a beautiful house in the best neighborhood in town, a place we could afford easily on my partnership income alone. We'd decorated it with original artwork and high-end furniture, creating the kind of elegant home the Miller family had always aspired to but never achieved. The contrast between our rising fortune and their declining circumstances was visible to everyone in their social circle. But the most significant change wasn't financial, it was social. The Miller family, who'd once been respected pillars of the Riverside Heights community, had become cautionary tale about the importance of recognizing potential and treating family members with respect. People whispered about how they'd missed their daughter-in-law's talent, how they'd excluded someone who could have elevated their entire family's status and security. Meanwhile, I was being featured in regional business publications, invited to speak at conferences across the country, and recognized as a model of entrepreneurial success. The same qualities the Miller family had seen as weaknesses, my independence, my creativity, my determination to build something from nothing, were now being celebrated as exactly the characteristics that defined successful business leaders. The final irony came when I received an invitation to join the board of directors for the Riverside Heights Community Foundation, the same organization where Linda had volunteered for years in minor roles. The position came with significant influence over local charitable giving and community development projects, the kind of social prominence the Miller family had always craved but never achieved. I accepted the position and used it to establish a scholarship fund for young entrepreneurs, particularly women starting creative businesses. The fund was designed to provide both financial support and mentorship for people whose potential might be overlooked or undervalued by traditional institutions. I named it the Independence Foundation, a subtle tribute to the contract that had taught me the value of self-reliance and strategic thinking. At the foundation's annual gala, where my scholarship fund was announced to the community's most prominent citizens, I delivered a speech about the importance of recognizing talent wherever it emerges and supporting people based on their potential rather than their current circumstances. I talked about how success often comes from unexpected places and how the greatest achievements are sometimes accomplished by people who've been underestimated or excluded. The Miller family attended that gala, sitting at a table near the back of the room, watching me receive recognition from the same social circle they'd spent years trying to impress. They saw me being celebrated for qualities they'd dismissed, achieving prominence they'd never imagined possible, and using my success to create opportunities for others who might face the same prejudices I'd encountered. As I finished my speech and looked out at the applauding audience, I caught sight of Linda and Robert at their distant table. They weren't clapping. They were simply staring, perhaps finally understanding the full magnitude of what their contract had cost them. Not just my financial support during their crisis, but my inclusion in their family, my respect for their judgment, and their access to the success they could have shared if they'd chosen inclusion over protection. The girl who'd signed their contract had become a woman who didn't need their approval, their money, or their acceptance. But more than that, she'd become someone whose success highlighted their limitations, whose achievements made their assumptions look petty and short-sighted, whose independence had proven more valuable than any security they could have offered. They'd wanted to make sure I knew my place, and their contract had taught me exactly that. My place was at the head table, receiving recognition for achievements they'd never imagined possible, using resources they'd never dreamed of accessing, and building a legacy that would outlast anything they'd ever accomplished. The contract they'd made me sign hadn't just protected them from my financial requests. It had protected me from the limitations of their imagination. And as I stood in that ballroom, surrounded by applause and opportunity, I realized that their greatest gift to me hadn't been the family dinners or the holiday gatherings or the grudging acceptance they'd eventually offered. Their greatest gift had been that contract, the document that had freed me to become everything they'd never believed I could be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.